Okay, now we are going to work on kind of separating some of this stuff and bringing some stuff forward and pushing some stuff back. So I've got a little bit of a gray color, and I'm going to kind of darken my water up here a little bit. And I'm going to take this gray, add it with a little bit darker blue. And I'm not completely painting over the whole thing. I'm letting some holes be present where the previous color is peeking through. Now I'm going to work on this bush. You should always wash your brush off in between colors. And so far I haven't changed my water because I've been kind of staying within the same color family. I haven't used any blacks. Here I've just got a little bit of brown. Tapping this along the bottom here of this cluster so it looks like that this area is darker and there's less light hitting it. There's no real need to separate out too much. You want to really avoid black. Black is one of the last things you're going to go to. Right now I'm just using a series of darker browns. Black will immediately kind of flatten something, so you want to avoid that. This brush keeps shedding. When that happens, you just kind of use your brush to lift the hairs off and get rid of them. I'm further just kind of separating out. I'm not really bothering with detail. These are in the distance. This is not my detailed layer. Right now what we're doing is called modeling. We are taking and adding a layer of texture on top of our block-in. It's not the time for detail yet. Detail is the last thing that you do. Modeling is where you separate your clumps, in this case clumps of foliage, whether they be trees or bushes currently. You're separating them into distinct areas and different clumps. You're not adding detail yet. You're just trying to create some texture to show that yes, these things are all grouped together, but they're not all one piece. I'm going to add a little bit of green in there. Bring that one up a little bit. So we're not trying to show every leaf. We're not trying to create detail yet. We're just kind of separating some things so these clumps don't seem like one or two great big masses. But at the same time, I'm trying to not just repeat the process that's above over here. I want these to look like distinctly different areas. So I got to be careful about that. Especially now that we're getting closer to us. We're getting closer to the bottom, closer to the viewer. So I'm going to have to start creating some kind of more detailed variety in what's going on down in the front compared to what I've got in these more distant clumps. Okay, I got up and got my liner brush. A liner brush is a brush that doesn't have very many hairs on it, and typically it'll be very long. A lot of kids will want to use a really short brush that has very few hairs. It's actually much easier to use one of these liner brushes that have really long hairs because this will hold more paint. I won't have to go back and get more paint as many times with this in the mark that I'm making than I will with a short, small bristle brush. If I use a small bristle brush, then every time that I go and get more paint, I'm going to be creating this kind of broken line rather than a nice smooth line. And I'm going to use this to create a few little branches. I'm grabbing some brown along with some gray. My son Matthew is walking through trying to be very quiet. How's your game going?
Good. We got a couple wins.
Well, that's good. Okay, now I kind of tested this with my finger before I started to see how wet the paper was, because I don't want my paint the minute I put this brush down to start spreading. I think I'm going to move on from my liner and use a little angled brush here. This is an angled brush. See how it's at an angle? And I'm going to use that. I'm mixing my dark brown and my blue together. And I'm going to use that to tap in, using the tip, a few little dark areas to try and separate this out just a little bit. And when you're doing things like this, you really want to avoid overly patterning something. I don't want to go tap, 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 tap in a straight line across, because if I do that, I'm going to create a very unnatural looking pattern that's almost like an A-B pattern that will jump out at the viewer as being this weird spot of man-made order almost in this natural world that you're creating. I'm still just using a little bit of brown. Move that. A little bit of brown and blue mixed together. It makes for a much more effective black because it's not too dark. It's not this big black hole going on. I keep bumping the little arm that my camera is on. And I'm not going to overdo these shadows. I'm not going to overdo it. I'm going to kind of just put them in randomly in areas to kind of further separate my stuff. And I'm kind of working semi-dry brush, which means I'm drying my brush off after I wash it so that there's no extra water on my brush, and then just getting my paint and using a drier brush to move my paint around. I do not want to overdo the water at this stage. I'm still would consider this kind of a modeling stage, right in between modeling and detail, because I'm just kind of working up some of my shadow areas. Okay, now I'm going to start working on my water, and I'm going to still be using this small angle brush, and I'm going to get some of my darker blue I'm going to be creating some tracks for my water. And this is another one of those instances where you don't want to overly pattern it. I don't want my stripes that I'm creating to be too much of a stripe here and a stripe there, with the gaps in the between the stripes and the stripes all being equally spaced, like it's some sort of bad wallpaper pattern. I don't want that to happen. I also don't want to overly outline my waterfall. I don't want to go through and outline everything. I want to kind of fuzz up my edge here. I don't want to overdo it with a really strong outline. Grabbing that really dark blue again. And we're going to have this darkness happening right here again. And I'm kind of using a hook, a curve right here, because I want it to look like my water is flowing over something that we can't see back in here. Now this is where we can use a little bit of salt. So I'm kind of getting some of my blue and I'm going to pat it down. And while it's still puddly and wet, just taking regular table salt, and I'm going to put some on there and give it a second. I'll dust it off more when it dries. And what happens there is the salt absorbs the watercolor and takes some of the pigment with it, and you get this really nice speckledy look. So I'm going ahead and letting my color be puddly. Going through and adding some salt on it. And then I'm going to go back in with my darker blues again, like I did before, because this water is going to be flowing a little bit, but at the same time it's not going to be as aggressively flowing as it was whenever it was coming off of the waterfall. Okay, so I'm going to let this dry a little bit and then we'll come back. Okay, we're going to work on some details now. I kind of emphasized my rocks a little bit right there, and now I'm going to, I dusted off my salt. Takes a little bit to get that off. And you can see how that created this nice fuzziness down there that's very indistinct. I'm going through, and this is actually a different type of paint. This is some white from a paint that I have called Gouache. And gouache comes in little tubes like this. And I'm using the white from my set because the white from the watercolors is just a little bit too timid. It doesn't really splash up. And a little bit of my yellow from over here got into there, but that's okay because water droplets do reflect, and they do create reflections of color. So I'm kind of breaking all that up right there. I'm going to grab a little bit more of my white. I changed my water so it's nice and clean for using my white. I'm also going to go through and kind of tap in little areas where I might have some foaming water kind of coming off there. And you could use a little bit of acrylic paint for this. You could also maybe use a colored pencil. Sometimes you have to use more than one material. I will have to admit, I haven't used watercolors in a very long time. I've been predominantly using oils. And before that, I was more of an acrylic painter. But honestly, that was out of necessity more than anything. I had used oils in my undergrad classes, and then I kind of got out of them once I was at home and teaching a lot, because when you have young children at home, very young children, as I did at that time, oil paints are very messy, the dry time is very slow, and the chemicals that are used in it, you know, I didn't want them around. So I used a lot of acrylic paints because the cleanup is just soap and water and things like that. The materials are different. So that was why I kind of leaned towards acrylic paints for a long time. And then I got back into oil paints whenever I was in my master's classes. I'm going to put just a few little broken dots to make it look like there's maybe some breakers out here, like this is an ocean. And I used quite a bit, and predominantly oil paints, whenever I was working on my master's degree. And I just kind of fell in love with them all over again. At first, the slower dry time, after using acrylics for so long, I'm just mixing up a little bit of this gouache in with some watercolor to create some nice little highlights. Gouache is opaque where watercolor is transparent. So sometimes it's nice to have another like opaque color that you can use to dot in these brighter, lighter colors, because you would not really be able to get as much of these light colors with watercolor. Watercolor tends to be very washed out, and very pale. And so if you want something a little bit more dramatic, you might mix up a little bit of thin acrylics and try and do some of your highlighting with these lighter colors. Anyway, like I was saying about oil paints, I used a lot of acrylic for a long time, and whenever I moved back to oil paints, the biggest adjustment was the dry time. Oil paints will literally take months and years to dry. So the dry time is I keep on hitting my arm extender for my camera with my paintbrush. The dry time for oil paints is months, weeks, sometimes years, depending on your application of the paint. So if you use your paint very thickly in oil paints, then the longer it takes to dry, unless you use some fast dry mediums, which can change the drying time. The advantage with acrylics and things like that, watercolor and gouache, is the drying is immediate. But at the same time, there's a necessity of speed that is required when the drying time is so short. You end up having to paint quicker and make some on the fly, like snap decisions, which can be great. The advantage is that if you do make a mistake with acrylics, you can get right into fixing it. You just got to wait a couple hours or an hour or so and let whatever mistakes you made dry. You can literally paint right on top of them, which is nice. With oils, you have to kind of wait a while to fix any mistakes that you have. So correcting a mistake is not as immediate with oil paints. You can still fix mistakes though. Once you kind of learn more about it, it's not as scary. Okay, and I'm just kind of dotting in some light that's too white. There's a mistake right there. I'm going to have to darken that up just a little bit more than what I need. There we go. I kind of grade it down a little bit. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to make it look like the light is hitting over here. And I'm just going to go through and kind of... So in this final detail stage, this is where you use your darker colors and your lighter colors. I tend to take colors and mix them together. If I do use some black, I might blue it a little bit or purple it to create some contrast. Wow, this brush is really not good. Right there, I'm going to add a little bit of purple along the edge for some contrast. This purple will also go nice with the fact that I've got these yellows over here. I'm just kind of randomly creating some texture there to kind of bring that crease down into there a little bit. All right. Well, I feel like this is pretty much done. This is probably the first time I've really used watercolor in about 10 years. So not too bad. Hopefully yours turns out really well. Your paper might cup a little bit. If it does that, just turn it over once it's completely dry and kind of roll it the opposite direction to kind of get that cup out of it. And hopefully you had a good time watching this, and good luck with yours.